Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here at this Centre for Energy Policy event, which is part of the University of Strathclyde's Engage with Strathclyde Week. We are here to talk about green jobs, and I'm very pleased to be joined by this incredibly august group of speakers who we have in front of us. I should say I'm Dustin Benton. I'm the Policy Director at Green Alliance. We're an environmental think tank and charity, and have done a lot of work on green jobs and skills over the last few years. I'm not going to do very much of introduction because we are joined by Professor Sir Jim McDonald, principal here at the school, who will do the job of properly introducing our panel and will say a bit about the University of Strathclyde's work and interest in green jobs, do a bit of scene setting here. Before I hand over to Jim, though, I'll just give you a few notes of housekeeping about how the session will run. So the first thing to say is we are recording the event, so be aware of that. However, only the presentations will be shared afterwards, not the discussion itself. So that is your cue to ask candid and difficult questions of our panelists. We would like it if you keep your microphones and cameras off during the main presentation, but please, when we are in the Q&A session, feel free to turn your cameras back on. We're going to do a Q&A after the speakers have a chance to have just a bit of a say of where their perspective is on the issue. Then I'll invite you to come in. And the way we'll run the questions is feel free to either pop a question in the Q&A in advance or just to raise your hand. We'd like you to sort of voice the questions because it's nicer to put a face to a name. You can introduce yourself. You can say who you are and where you're from just very, very briefly. And then the panel will respond to that. So do use the hand raise function and I'll ask you to come in at the right time. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Jim McDonald for his opening remarks. Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dustin. And I guess it's good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you that have been logging into the meeting from across the globe. And I think, again, because of the ravages of COVID, we've now realised that we can decouple productivity from travel, and we're also keeping our carbon footprint down as we engage with this international audience. So Dustin, thank you first and foremost for chairing and leading the event, and from me to you, Karen, as Director of the Centre for Energy Policy, thank you very much for your leadership. As Dustin mentioned, this meeting today has been couched in the context of Engage with Strathclyde. It's something we've been running for about 10 years now. Over the last week and through this week, we have about 35 different events about opening up and facilitating, catalysing and informing debates across a whole host of areas, none of which more important than what we might say is the existential challenge for the 21st century, and that is climate change and its impact on society and our ability to thrive. But of course, given the number of economists that are on this call, importantly, how we address the need to mitigate, to navigate, to deal with climate change, we should be creating economic opportunity as well, because there's no more just transition than to give people a job and to allow them to thrive as individuals as they pursue their career in a way that supports a progressive society as we go forward. So the Centre for Energy Policy sits within our Government and Public Policy school. It's well positioned there. However, Karen is by no means confined into our colleagues in humanities and social sciences. She works closely with our engineers, our scientists, those in the business school. And I think that is a very good proxy for how we as a community, we as society need to deal with climate change. It's a big, wicked problem, and we have to take what I might refer to as a whole systems approach to dealing with this. Apart from being principal at this university, I have the privilege of being president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, which is one of the UK's 4 national academies. And through that, I sit on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. And almost exactly 3 years ago, we submitted a letter, and that's how we communicate with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Office. These letters tend to be 30 or 40 pages long, but we wrote a letter to him from the Council, with which I was a co-signatory around taking that whole systems approach, recognising it's an amalgam of policy, technology, economics, regulation, and very importantly, society. You know, we have to communicate and bring with us those that are in many cases are those that are most vulnerable and are most exposed to the challenges of climate change in particular. And that whole systems approach is important. However, the policy that our governments, both in the UK, here in Scotland and internationally, the policies that we must develop have to be informed by strong analysis, good thinking, multidisciplinary teams, and through our Centre for Energy Policy, which we'll hear more about shortly. I think that's acted to catalyse that multiplicity of views and recognising that we need to get started now. I've indicated to you I'm an engineer. Halfway through COP26, the Royal Academy of Engineering published a low regrets investments paper, which was deliberately poised to transition from that general public debate piece for the conference into the meeting in the blue zone of all the key political leaders and decision makers, and recognising, quite frankly, that 2050 for net zero is just around the corner. We've been talking about decarbonisation for as long as my career's been running, and I've worked in utility industries, worked for manufacturing companies and the likes, but we need to make sure that we start making these moves now, whether it's decarbonising industrialised nations or investing in infrastructure and creating wealth opportunities for those nations that are further behind, but in the developing part of the curve. We need to get moving. And what's ringing in my ears was the words of John Kerry during COP26 about the need to be committing around about $2 trillion per annum in investment to create jobs, infrastructure, and actions. It's been hard enough to try and get the £100 billion that was pledged underway, but we have to redouble our efforts and recognise that time is not our friend. And as an engineer, I'm looking more to 2030, to the projects, the jobs that we can create, the impacts that we can have as we go forward. So that whole systems approach is key. And a hero of mine that I'm delighted to say has become a friend over recent years is Lord Nick Stern. And you remember just about 16 years ago, the eponymous Stern report was published here in the UK around the economics of climate change. And I commend it still to you. It's a good read. It's very strongly evidence-based, and it talks about how international cooperation is fundamental, but also as we address the challenges of climate change, let's create economic opportunity. About 10 years ago at Skills Development Scotland, which is our national skills agency, I co-chair the Scottish Government's Energy Advisory Board. We commissioned them to come up with the first skills action plan, and it was on energy. And at that time, in Scotland alone, we felt there'd be about 35,000 jobs. It was heavily bundled around carbon capture and storage at that time, which of course has waxed and waned. And we've got a pipeline of prospective new pilot projects again. We're hoping that the Scottish Acorn project will be confirmed in that second wave. But in total, around the new green jobs, Skills Development Scotland thought there were going to be about 35,000 jobs in that space. In fact, we achieved less than 10% of that over the past decade. So whilst we have these big targets, and we should have, we need to remember that action must follow policy priorities. And that's going to mean a mixture of public, private, academic sectors working together and getting private sector investment behind us, because the public purse is stretched to breaking point just now, and we have to create the conditions where private investment follows it. And in Scotland, again, if I calibrate, I led a report which was published about a year and a half ago called the Strategic Impact Assessment for Floating Offshore Wind. And we estimated there was somewhere between £3 and £5 billion of gross value added benefit for capturing floating offshore wind manufacturing, as well as aftermarket service deployment, creating about 5,000 jobs into the bargain. And if we couple again now the perspective of a hydrogen industry through large electrolyzing plants fueled by green energy, the electrical infrastructure that needs to be created for industry and for transport, the whole built environment and the construction industry need to decarbonise. The manufacturing sector, which now has a premium on decarbonising their processes. All I can say is the prize is enormous, i.e. dealing with climate change. And if we get our plan together with good evidence-based policy advice, then I suggest we must remain optimistic that we can tackle all of this challenge and create opportunity, not least of which for those that very often are furthest away from that opportunity, and that's by creating jobs, industry and business opportunity. So with that, I wish you well for the meeting. I look forward to hearing the opening statements from our colleagues. And Dustin, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thanks very much. Loads there, particularly I share the memory of CCS waxing and waning over the years. So that is certainly one which I'm sure we will return to in conversation. But I want to kick off the panel and I'll ask Professor Karen Turner, who heads up the Centre for Energy Policy, to give us an beginning statement, sort of setting out what the Centre is doing and her take on the core question of the day, which is how do we deliver on the promise of green jobs? So Karen, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dustin, and thank you very much, Sir Jim, for opening us today. So the Centre for Energy Policy, Jim's already kind of broadly told you what it is that we do, but basically, I mean, we've been around. We're about nearly 9 years old now. We were established in November 2014, formally launched in May 2015 at one of these Strathclyde Engage events, and our work, which is in partnership with government, industry, trade unions, other academics, is generally focused on ensuring transitions to mid-century net zero targets can deliver sustainable and equitable prosperity throughout the economy. And we've been doing research through a number of projects that have been funded through different EPSRC initiatives by Innovate UK, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, IDRIC, the European Climate Foundation, to name but a few. One key focus in our research has been looking at labour markets and how they will respond to net zero actions and drive net zero outcomes. And in particular, we're interested in how it's not just about the number of jobs that are possible and what the labour demand might be. It's how labour markets respond. But we see a lot in the news at the moment about people's challenges with their real wages falling and things like that. So there's a whole challenge in terms of whether or not the skills and the people are going to be there, what wage rates are going to be, and generally all of what goes on. The labour market is a big part of our economy, so labour market challenges can impact both on net zero project delivery, but also the wider economy outcomes of different net zero actions, and that's including but not limited to things like GDP and jobs, but crucially people's real incomes. And I think, because as Jim's already said, a lot of the focus in these discussions has been on the potential of quite large number of jobs that could be created as part of the transition. And I think we picked out some figures on this slide just from across different policy documents in the news. So for example, the figure of there could be 440,000 jobs as we work to net zero. That's from the UK government's net zero strategy. There's been a figure put out there about 50,000 jobs in relation to and across a broad range of activities relating to carbon capture, utilisation and storage. And in the heat and building strategy, we get the figure of 175,000 jobs. So there's a lot of discussion about the potential, but I think while there has been focus on the types of skills that we will need, I think if you click onto the next slide, whoever's operating, please. I think that the real challenge lies in that there hasn't been enough attention to how the type of labour market conditions and the constraints that we're currently facing and are likely to continue to face in the UK, how this will impact outcomes. In particular, there hasn't been sufficient consideration of whether workers with the appropriate skills and expertise are going to be available in sufficient numbers at the right times to service both our net zero needs and also the economic opportunities that the transition offers. And this is, I think, crucially, as Jim was saying, there's a lot of attention quite rightly now on up to 2030 because we really need to get going. But that means that there's going to be a lot of projects going on at the same time in the economy, not just net zero ones, there's other infrastructure ones. And if we have got a limited pool of labour in this country, we don't have free migration of workers anymore in and out of the economy. So basically we're facing what economists call a labour supply constraint, but it means that projects and activities will have to compete over workers. And if we don't have the appropriate levels of skills and expertise and we can't get the numbers of peoples, then we could start to get different cost pressures and related price pressures that will both bring additional cost to projects, to the wider transition, and crucially could further affect the cost of living and doing business in different and some are all different time frames. And I think this is critical. It's really critical because particularly in the context of the labour supply constraints we're facing at the moment, where the Office for National Statistics and different energy industry bodies have continued to report that there are worker and skill shortages, and this is a major barrier to progress. And then if you take into consideration the number of major infrastructure projects that are slated to take place, so including around HS2, Hinkley Point C, but also have new hospital building and things like that, all of these projects need to be delivered within relatively tight time frames, and they will be competing for finite resources. So the slide that I've got here, this is just an example from our own research. I mean, carbon capture and storage has already been mentioned in the Acorn project in particular, and we've been working with the partners up at Acorn through an Innovate UK project, where we've been looking at a new, instead of just talking about sequestering emissions, and economists would talk about creating a new Scottish transport and storage industry that could help transition oil and gas away from fossil fuels. And we've looked at what kind of employment might be created, not just in the industry, but through economy-wide impacts. And you can see that the figures on the right-hand side is kind of our central case, so a new Scottish CO2 transport and industry around the Acorn project that would be sequestering up to 6.4 million tonnes of CO2 per annum, about 60% of which would be generated in the Scottish cluster. The rest would be exploiting export opportunities for countries that can't store their own CO2. That could ultimately support just under 1,100 full-time jobs across UK supply chains, and as incomes and employments grow. However, there would be some displacement of employment in other sectors as real wages are bid up in this supply-constrained labour market we've got. But if you look on the left-hand side, we've got higher figures, and that's really the type of figures that you would expect if there either wasn't any labour supply constraint or it doesn't bring any wage pressure into the system. So the possible jobs could more than triple, up to nearly 4,000. So sometimes that would be a figure that would be cited, but when you take into account the wage pressures, the actual number might be a bit smaller. So we need to disentangle, if you've got, like Jim was saying earlier, that we've only had a fraction of the jobs potential in Scotland. Is that because we've just not done the projects, or is that because we've been doing the projects and all these supply constraints have really bit? So if you go on to my final slide, please. I think you need to, dealing with labour supply constraints, we need to kind of work down through a number of levels. So first of all, if you've got a fixed number of workers in the economy, you can't easily bring people in. What can you do? Well, you could have migration of workers, or if you want to grow the domestic labour supply, you could do like government's trying to do at the moment, of trying to encourage greater participation in the labour market, both full-time and bringing experienced workers back, or you look to increase labour productivity so that you can have increased the effective labour supply. But the supply constraint is persisting. We know that it's there. So what does it do? It brings in competition between sectors and projects for appropriate skilled labour. So then, even if you're not growing the absolute numbers, can you grow the skills? Can you develop them through the existing and also the transitioning workforce? But that means that there really is a need for strategic policy planning. And then it takes us down to this last point. I've talked about wage pressure in the economy, but wage pressure actually means real wages are rising. That's a policy aim as well, and it would be an aim of most people who want to see real incomes rising. And so then we start to get into some real trade-offs about the desirability of having higher real wages and not having this equate to cost of living pressure. And again, you've got issues around increasing productivity, but really, I think this is the crux of the challenge that we come down to. If we want to, kind of post-Brexit, that we don't have as much migration into the economy and we grow the domestic labour force, how do we do that? How do we want real wages to grow to improve people's incomes? But how do we do that without bringing challenges for the cost of living? And I think this is really an issue we need to look at, especially in this run up to 2030, where we want to do a lot of stuff, but we've got constrained resources, particularly in our labour markets. So I hope, Dustin, that's helped set the scene for some of the other people coming in on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. You have posed what is a deliciously painful question. Do we go for productivity, immigration, or greater labour market participation? Stephen Mills from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero is going to come in next, but I don't know that I will set him up to answer or to provide the definitive answer on that question. He is Head of Hydrogen and Industrial Carbon Capture, and we'll talk a bit about the government's policy priorities in that area. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dustin, and great to follow from that great scene setter from Karen. So yes, as Dustin says, I'm Stephen Mills. I sit within the Hydrogen and Industrial Carbon Capture Directorate here in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. My team and I look after thinking about how we can maximise the economic opportunity from both the move to a hydrogen economy and also the development and development and deployment of CCS here in the UK, and also thinking about how we can get trade investment in both sectors as well. So thank you very much for asking me to come along today. I'd like to take this opportunity just to say a few scene-setting words around what we're doing within the department in terms of preserving and supporting green jobs and across across government more generally. So just in terms of the new department, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, so that was set up in February, so 3 months old, I think potentially to the day. And our focus is on 4 areas, which of course bring skills really neatly together. 1, on energy security, so of course setting the UK on a path to greater energy independence. 2, bringing bills down, making wholesale electricity prices in particular the cheapest in Europe. 3, climate security, meeting our policy targets and advocating for action more generally, globally. And then 4th, of course, is economic security, recognising the growth potential. Into all of those as a very neat thread. So I think, as Karen kind of said, but we often say, perhaps a bit glibly, that net zero and our wider environmental goals of government depend on the UK having the right workforce with the right skills and capacity in the right locations at the right time. And in the next 30 years, the net zero transition will drive opportunities for job creation, with existing occupations set to evolve as the UK economy decarbonises. And it'll be really, really important to manage this shift, with parts of the country requiring more transitional support, particularly where there may be low productivity areas of the UK. But as the UK transitions to net zero, 1 in 5 workers will experience shifting demand for skills, which is quite substantial. And that implies a substantial need to upskill and reskill our current workforce. But alongside that, we also need to bring new workers and talent along with us in the transition. We need to ensure that all future economic growth, whether it be in the net zero space or more widely, is inclusive and benefits across the whole of the UK, and we ensure that levelling up across the whole country. So just in terms of action, only a few weeks ago, the department published a suite of documents that set out our approach and our thinking in this space. So most relevant of the suite of documents are the net zero strategy, the energy security strategy, and Powering Up Britain, which set out how the UK will drive innovation, create a skilled workforce, and establish domestic supply chains. So the net zero strategy, sorry, the light seems to have gone off in the space I'm in, so hopefully you can still see me. The net zero strategy that was first published, I think 2 years, 18 months ago now, spoke of 440,000 jobs, which Karen just mentioned, across net zero industries in 2030. But actually, news just in, I think the British Energy Security Strategy last year updated this to 480,000 jobs, so an increase of 40,000 jobs there, which just goes to show the incremental increase in what we can expect to see. From my perspective, on hydrogen and CCS, they present particularly strong opportunities for the UK and indeed for Scotland, of course, which is I appreciate the focus for many of you on the line today. For CCS, we foresee 50,000 jobs by 2030, so in the next 7 years. And our analysis in the hydrogen economy is that we could see 12,000 jobs being supported at the same time across hydrogen production, transportation and storage. That does not include the end users. We're hoping to get some more granular figures that can include the end users for the hydrogen economy, because that will significantly, I think, increase that 12,000 number. And by 2050, we'll certainly be seeing a greater number of jobs in both sectors. We're talking significant numbers. And many of these jobs will rely on skills that already exist here in the UK, such as process and gas engineering, systems integration, procurement, construction, health and safety, and so on. And many of them will be a transition opportunity for people in the oil and gas sector, for example. I should say also, CCS and hydrogen will also play a crucial role in enabling the transition of the manufacturing sector itself to net zero. as these decarbonisation technologies will be protecting many of the 2.5 million or so jobs in the manufacturing sector here in the UK, as we create new markets for green steel, low carbon cement, etc. And the government is determined for the UK to become a world leader in CCS and hydrogen technologies, as we expect many jobs that we create over the next few decades will not only support the deployment and development of the UK domestic market, but also be something we can capitalise on in terms of exports of technologies, goods, services, and skills. I'll just say a few quick words around some of the actions we are taking within the sort of wider framework. Partnership working, I think, is the mantra here. So delivering a net zero workforce is as alluded to earlier, a joint endeavour between government, industry, and the education and academic sectors, which is why various fora have been developed that looked to take this forward jointly. And so back in November 2020, the department, or the predecessor department, BEIS, set up the Green Jobs Task Force, which delivered its government a report to government in July 2021. And that task force brought together the trades union and the skills and education sector, and made a series of recommendations to government, which may come up in the conversation later. And in May 2022, so last year, the department, jointly with other departments in government, launched a Green Jobs Delivery Group in collaboration with industry. This group is co-chaired by the Energy Minister and the CEO of E.ON. So that work is taking forward, and it also has ministerial representation from the Department for Education, DEFRA, and the Department for Work and Pensions, as well as some representatives from local government and the education skills sector. Now, what that group is doing is taking a series of deep dives into the challenges in various low carbon sectors, with a view to thinking about how real actions can be taken forward to support workers during the transition and ensure we have the right skills available at the right time. And that goes to Jim's comments earlier at the beginning around the vital need for strong evidence and analysis. So we're really working to try and understand how we can do the analysis of the scenarios and that we look forward to seeing in the deployment of these low carbon sectors. The government's also responding to the Committee on Climate Change and Chris Skidmore's recommendations to a joint industry net zero and nature workforce action plan, which will be in the first half of next year, 2024, and represent the culmination of several of those deep dives across the sectors, which will be taking place in the coming months. I will stop there. Really keen to hear the perspectives of the other speakers, and look forward to the Q&A session later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. There is an awful lot of activity going on. I feel like you are a department that is paddling furiously underneath the surface, so more power to your elbow, I suppose. We are now joined by Lawrence Turner, who is Head of Policy and Research at GMB, who will be giving us a bit of a perspective from the GMB membership on the reality of the transition for the sectors that his organisation represents. So, Lawrence, over to you.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you to the Centre for Energy Policy and to all those who organised today's event. I'm starting with an image. I'm not sure how well people can see it, but it's not an image of wind turbines or solar panels, but this is workers protesting against job losses at Burnt Island Fabrications in Fife in 2010, after promised renewables orders failed to materialise. And if we could move on to the second slide, please. Thank you. So I think these sobering figures show why, according to the official central estimates for the low carbon and renewable energy economy, what we might call green jobs, employment in the overall sector grew by just 11,500 FTE jobs, or just under 5% growth over an 8-year period. And you can compare that to the loss of 47,000 manufacturing jobs across the whole economy over the same period. And the log scale here obscures, I think, some of the very small employment contributions that some very heavily promoted sectors, such as offshore wind, make at the moment, and the fact that domestic jobs in solar have fallen by a third, or estimated to have fallen by a third, during that time, and part of that is due to the price of imports falling due to the very heavy involvement of forced Uyghur labour in the solar supply chain. Could move on next slide, please. Thank you. So this next slide is historic, but I think it represents an important challenge to all of us who care about jobs. So during the UK's transition from town to natural gas, which is often held up as one of the only examples of a true just transition in the UK's history, and which was certainly a very successful policy in a lot of ways, the number of jobs in the sector actually fell during that time. And this is largely due to the transitioning out of high employment in intensity gasification plants. And I think we're going to see something similar with the shift to renewables today, which require relatively fewer jobs in their operation. Job losses were concentrated among blue-collar workers, and despite efforts at the time, there's relatively little redeployment into the new jobs that were created in that industry among those workers who were displaced. And final slide, please. Thank you. And so finally, I think we have a mature understanding now as well about the devastating and destabilizing consequences of industrial closures and mass layoffs. These effects range from the immediate health and social problems, often very community focused, through to the very long-term hysteresis or social scarring that follows industrial closures. We know too that most workers do not redeploy into equivalent or equivalently paying jobs as part of some harmonious market adjustments. And the older workers, manual workers, workers from ethnic minority backgrounds, and those with caring responsibilities, and disabled workers find it harder to redeploy. Or to put it another way, when we're talking about planning and redeployment, we often say to employers and policymakers that we can't treat the labour market as if they're units who can be readily moved from one column of employment to another. And thank you, that's the end of the slides. So looking ahead to the path to net zero, the CCC has said that a shortage of skilled workers poses a critical threat to the government's climate targets. So we think that we need to learn the lessons from the UK's past experience and confront the apparent paradox of there being simultaneously too few jobs in the green economy and also too few workers. And these are some of the problems which Karen has talked about and which we're working on through the Future Energy Skills programme, which brings together academics, employers and trade unions, and which is co-chaired by GMB's General Secretary Gary Smith and Centrica's CEO Chris O'Shea. And from a trade union perspective, while the scale of the challenge cannot be overestimated, there are policies that we think the government could be putting into place now to avoid what might be called an unjust transition. First, workers need to be involved in transition planning from workplace level right through to Whitehall. No one knows how their industries can be decarbonised and their future skills requirements better than the people doing those jobs now. But engagement from a government level and amongst other policy members has often been inconsistent or tokenistic. Social dialogue is a core part of the international definitions of a just transition, and the UK needs to change its track record. In plain language, it means that solutions must be developed with workers and not imposed upon them. Secondly, there is a gap at the moment in UK procurement and spending policy. Social value requirements would be applied if solar panels or wind turbines were being procured through direct government spending, but this does not apply to subsidies, even though which is the mechanism through which the vast majority of green support is channeled. This, we think, is a loophole in a social value legislation that is contributing to the offshoring of jobs and a lack of quality employment in the UK and should be closed. Third, we should be aiming to decarbonise existing industries and existing jobs to the greatest extent practicable, avoiding or soothing industrial shocks to the greatest extent possible. And this approach has important implications to the technological routes where there is a choice, to the decarbonisation of particular industries. And we've already heard about the importance of hydrogen for the decarbonisation of a number of sectors, from home heating to manufacturing and to transport. Fourth, the evidence suggests that low-cost generalised skills training, such as in maths and English proficiency, although it might be easiest to deliver, has limited value for displaced workers. And this means that policymakers should be looking at how to support clear routes to attain certified skills in shortage areas. And then finally, the last great energy successful transition in home heating, the town gas to natural gas programme, how it was delivered, including its very successful skills programme, through a conversion executive which had statutory powers and under a negotiated national labour agreement. And this national agreement was essential in a tight labour market similar to the one that we face today for establishing consistent rates of pay and employment and preventing competition for scarce skills. And we should be looking at creating a similar body today. So I'm conscious that my 5 minutes may well be coming to the end. So I'll just finish on this point. Net zero is happening, but we can choose how we achieve it. If there is an unjust transition, then we risk turning workers against the environmental imperative, so we cannot afford to get this wrong. That's everything I wanted to say. I'm looking forward to hearing the other contributions and the discussion, and thank you very much indeed for the chance to speak to you today.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And a particularly helpful reminder from, as you say, the UK's last major heating transition. We will be in the midst of another heating transition before too long, and I hope we learn the lessons from the last one. I have one small housekeeping point just to insert before I invite Jamie to give his contribution, and that is that I've been informed that the Q&A function in Zoom webinars does not permit me to have you actually ask a question in person. So you will have to type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will read them off to make sure that the panelists get a chance to answer them. So my apologies that you won't be able to voice them yourselves, but hopefully for those introverts amongst us, they will welcome the opportunity to ask questions without having to go and do it yourself. Anyway, please do pop those things in the Q&A, and I will hand over to Jamie Carter, who is the Senior Policy Manager for Employment at Make UK, who will talk a bit about the experiences of his members across the manufacturing industry in the transition so far. So Jamie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dustin, and afternoon, everybody. Good to be with you, and thank you to the Centre for inviting me today, and to my fellow speakers for some really interesting and thought-provoking points made so far. I wanted to focus my remarks predominantly on the question of skills. It is by far and away the biggest challenge that our members tell us about across all of their operations, and particularly in the context of sustainability and achieving net zero. So that is what we tend to focus on. We have not necessarily tried to quantify, for example, the number of jobs that might be created or that might be at risk as a result of the transition and push for net zero, but thinking about the kinds of skills that manufacturers require, how existing jobs will change and evolve, and what is needed as a result in terms of the availability of skills now and in the future. And I'm glad that at the start Sir Jim referred to sort of his timeline for thinking about this as between now and 2030, because that's how we often frame this conversation with our members as well. what needs to happen in actually just the next few years in terms of their workforce to enable them to become more sustainable, and get the right skills and the right people in place to be able to operate in a more environmentally sustainable way. 37% of manufacturers identify sustainability and net zero as the factor that is driving the changing skills needs in their businesses between now and 2030. Encouragingly, a majority, 61% of manufacturers, believe that their workforce already largely has the right technical skills to manufacture and produce goods in a more sustainable way. But also a majority are nevertheless still looking to review their workforce strategies to access and develop the right technical skills over the coming years. I think there are three specific areas where we see manufacturing employers focus in particular, where they see increased demand for skills and jobs when it comes to sort of thinking green. Resource efficiency, thinking about things like carbon accounting, improving things like lean manufacturing, things around sort of energy use and generation, nuclear and renewable energy, how to minimize carbon emissions, and finally the development of new or amended products. So for example, the design and production of electric vehicles. A lot of the activity on skills that we see from manufacturers is in the area of digital skills, and the sort of transition to a more technologically advanced and digitalized approach to manufacturing, going hand in hand with becoming more sustainable. Many of the skills that manufacturers say they need to access in order to become more sustainable are shared with improving adoption of new technology to, say, improve productivity. So accelerating the deployment of new clean technologies, reducing their use of resources and becoming more efficient, having the right tools and approaches in place to measure progress in terms of achieving sustainability. That is relying on a range of digital skills that are not necessarily in themselves labelled as green skills, but are intrinsic to manufacturers being able to deliver that. I think that also extends to higher level skills, not just in terms of higher level technical skills. And we know that as jobs evolve in the context of sustainability, that there is a higher level of technical skill required, but also areas like innovation, leadership and management, areas like social and emotional skills, so sort of non-technical skills like that are a real priority, and we see that coming across very strongly in our research. I think, you know, these big trends of sustainability and accompanied by digitalization, they are inevitably requiring employers to embark on big cultural changes in how they work, how they operate, how they engage with their workforce. And so there is a need to have the right leaders and managers in place to take the workforce through that process, to be able to handle changes to people's jobs and the skills required sensitively, you know, reflecting on the points I think Lawrence made about, you know, to ensuring that employers are able to provide the right support to those employees whose jobs are changing, or, you know, they might fear or at risk, ensuring that employers and employees are having really good, constructive two-way dialogues. And I mentioned as well sort of higher technical skills. You know, we see the transition generally in manufacturing away from sort of low to intermediate levels of technical skill for many roles towards higher and advanced technical skills. And there is a need for that to be reflected in the availability of training provision and what happens in compulsory education, as well as things that are sort of focused on work-based training with employers. In order to address and progress some of those points, Make UK has called for a number of policy changes to support that. So Jim rightly made the point that so much in this space relies on government and industry sort of working together to create the right conditions for private sector organisations to invest. Employers in our sector are keen to make that investment in skills and jobs, but they need the right support from government to be able to do that. We would like to see better support for upskilling and retraining. That's improved access to short modular courses throughout people's careers and working lives, particularly for those who are already in work, and delivering the sorts of changes already in train to achieve net zero in 2050. We would like to see incentives for apprenticeship standards where there are skills and labour shortages, targeted at green skills and occupations which are most relevant to achieving net zero. Again, sort of referring back to another point that Lawrence made around, policymakers focusing not just on sort of lower level generic skills, but having targeted funding support and incentives for employers to focus on the skills and occupations that really matter. That could be something like, for example, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education is currently looking at revising the apprenticeship standard for installation electricians to support the delivery and rollout of infrastructure for electric vehicles. Having incentives in place for those sorts of specific occupations and training so that we are focusing on the right things. We'd like to see more effective support through the tax system. We've called for a green skills tax credit to incentivise and reward employer investment in specific areas of green skills. And we'd like to see better access to digital and green skills in the pre and post-16 curriculum. So looking at sort of basic levels of digital skills, understanding of things like energy efficiency in the national pre-16 curriculum across different subjects. But again, looking at the vocational and technical education space and making sure that the training provision that is offered across the country is targeted in the right areas. I think my time is up, so I will leave it there, but looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And we've had a very well-rounded set of contributions from our panel coming from a bunch of compatible but different directions. So thank you all.